It is usual to distinguish 7 movements of the will, that is, hope and fear, joy, sorrow, love, hatred, and remorse. Of these, 4 confront what is evil, 3 are bent on acquiring good. Fear and sorrow, hate and remorse are in the first group. Hope and joy and love in the second. Now, since the movements of the will are directed in accordance with the judgment of reason and truth towards their proper object, a man is said to be virtuous when he fears what should indeed be feared. So this is kind of what I was talking about yesterday, with one individual. But it's not so much. I mean, there's a human aspect to us. There's a human aspect to us, and those human aspects, there's a reality. There's a reality that we have to live. We don't live in fantasy land. We don't live in fantasy land, and that's some of the problems sometimes you read with the books on the saints. It's not that they lived in fantasy land either. It's just that we only get to see this beautifully painted picture that you want to aspire to, and then when that doesn't happen, you're shattered over it. You're shattered over it because you didn't get to see this thing happen. No, the saints live in reality, and the bad things that happen to them, they seem so glorious in the books. It was a bad thing that happened. It was a bad thing that happened to a saint. It's just the fact that the saint handled it properly. Do you see? So to say that you're not a coward because you fear, it's a virtue to fear something that should be feared. Do you see? That's what he's saying here. People get very naive today, and you got to be very careful of being too naive about things. Not just reading stuff and getting something stuck in your head. We don't live in fantasy land, and we're not to live in fantasy land. The saints didn't live in fantasy land. Okay, there's a reality. There's a reality that has to be understood and lived. If not, you just go through life completely destroyed. That is, there's like a demoralization that happens because your reality, or what you think is reality, your fantasy land, doesn't meet up with reality. Do you see? But the great workings of grace and the spiritual life happen in reality. They happen in reality. That's why you can actually think, you could have a confrere, Padre Pio, think he wasn't a saint. He wasn't a saint. He sat in the choir and would yawn. He'd yawn. He'd be sitting there yawning. Saints don't yawn. Fantasy land. See that? Fantasy land. You think that the only thing the saints do in choir float. They just sit there and float and have rays radiating from their face and stuff like that. That's the only thing the saints do. They don't yawn when they're in the choir trying to pray. So he wasn't a saint. That's what one of his confreres thought. How in the world? Reality. Padre Pio he had the stigmata, but Padre Pio lived in reality. He didn't live in fantasy land. And he grieves, but only over what is really sad. When he hates what is deserving of hatred, and is ashamed of what is really shameful, and always with that degree of grief, hate, or shame, which is in proportion to the evil, greater or less as the care may be. See that? Even in the way of perfection, there are cares that we have. Similarly, his hope should be rightly fixed, his love and his joy, and all once more in proportion to the measure of the good in question. Now we're talking about the will, but the object of the will is happiness. It seeks that perfection of happiness. And that's why you see people in San Francisco dying over fentanyl. Because the thing is they've fixed their natural will seeks some kind of happiness. The distortion that they live thinks that the happiness can be found in fentanyl. Do you see? But the fact is, and that goes on with what we were talking about yesterday, the fact is they are seeking some kind of happiness. And that answers the question that someone had about how is it that someone they can turn their evil into good. And that's how you turn your evil into good. They're seeking a good. They're seeking a good out in the world, and they're trying to convince themselves that using fentanyl or some other drug. Nowadays, you even have in a lot of states marijuana is legal, so you can just justify that because if it's legal, you're okay. If it's illegal, you can't do it. You have to buckle up. It's the law. You can't drink alcohol till you're 21. You can't whatever else it is. But the fentanyl, obviously, will kill you. But the point is the person's looking for an alleviation from the dread that they live every day, right? So that's a drastic example that you can see. But what are they seeking? They're seeking something that their will is fixed in. It's fixed in the desire for happiness. And that's not like, that's where we distort what that happiness is supposed to be. It does make sense. I mean, you desire to eat food that tastes good, and that's why you have taste buds and things like that to help you want to eat the food that does taste good. But then you have to, because of concupiscence and the fall of man from Adam and Eve, we have to mortify and not just eat whatever tastes good, because then we become super duper fat. But the point there is, even though eating stuff is killing you because you're getting super duper fat and is very, very unhealthy, it comes from the natural will that's fixed in finding its perfection in happiness. Do you see? Because that happiness, it means we were created by somebody who is pure happiness. That is beatitude. It makes sense. That's why you can talk to a homeless person and start asking them questions. Like, they don't care a thing about God. Not all homeless people, but so you'll talk to some homeless people that they're living only for the moment and fulfilling every need that they want. But that's the point. Because they're seeking to fulfill whatever their need is. You're saying, well, they're homeless. A lot of homeless people that I've ever met, and when I was in England, I worked with them all the time. A lot of the homeless people I've ever worked with, they were homeless because they wanted what they wanted. That is a distortion of the happiness that their will is fixed in, or at least fixed in desiring, right? Do you see? The supreme good is God, and He is to be loved supremely, hoped for above everything, rejoiced in beyond all else. All that draws away the soul from God, and especially vice and sin is wholly evil for all men and for all men without exception. No benefit can come from it, nor any good be drawn from it. And this is what you hear. You hear from those stupid phones. They'll say, but if I didn't have this phone, first off, my phone's not stupid. That's what they'll say. Yeah, I know, because they called it a smartphone. Okay, they called it a smartphone. My phone's not stupid. Okay, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to offend you for talking about your phone. Then the other thing that they'll say is, well, if it wasn't for my phone, I would have never heard this talk. Yeah, you probably don't need to hear this talk. You see, that's just it. Like, God doesn't need you to have a phone that you also look up dirty things on to have. And I know everybody doesn't look up dirty things on phones, but the big problem with phones isn't that everybody looks up dirty things. It's that it keeps their attention constantly wrapped on the phone. And whatever your attention's constantly wrapped on, it's not, it's going to be taken away from what it should be wrapped on. That's what recollection is. If you use one of those phones, you won't enter into recollection. You just won't do it. Won't do it. But if it wasn't for this phone, I wouldn't have heard this. I wouldn't even come into the faith. You could almost say that's blasphemy. And why could you say it's blasphemy? Because God doesn't need a phone to bring you to the faith. The reason He used the phone to bring you to the faith is because that's all you do is stare at the phone. Do you see? That's the point. It's like if He'll still find a way to get to you, but if you didn't use that stupid thing all the time, then he would be able to get to you more easily, maybe by directly through your conscience, which wouldn't be so polluted by a buzzing and dinging and shaking of a little electronic device. No benefit can come from it, nor any good be drawn from it, except only perhaps to this extent, that with good men, the sins they have endured in others or their own past sins, from which they have been now delivered, may arouse in them a deeper spirit of humility and a more ardent love of God. See that? And that's why past sins and even past hurts from other people aren't things that are supposed to keep bringing us to our knees. Now, I don't mean to our knees in prayer. I mean to our knees in grief. Some people do. They let their sins constantly bring them back down into grief. And there you go. That gets into doubting the power of God because they think, how could he ever forgive me for that? Well, who are you? I mean, who are you that he can't forgive you for that? It doesn't make any sense. It's absolute pride and vanity to think, because you want to put yourself in this special kind of category where even God can't forgive you. Even God can't forgive the stupid things you used to do. See, did you hear what the used to do? There you go. If you've repented from them, then they're gone. Used to do. He doesn't focus on that anymore. He knew from all eternity you were going to do those stupid things. He gave you the grace so you wouldn't do the stupid thing. You did it anyways. And then when you asked for forgiveness, he gave it. Done. Story's done. And then what about the other people that you get upset with because they hurt you, because they gave you the middle finger when you went through the stop sign, or when they said they weren't going to speak to you anymore because you spilled coffee on their brand new book, or whatever else. I'm not talking about like serious abuse or things like that. I'm talking about the simple things that end relationships. But for that kind of stuff, we've sinned too. That's the whole point of the whole story. We sin too, so I can understand how they sinned. What he's saying here is it's to bring us to a spirit of humility, not of grief, not of constant grief, but to realize that I'm weak, and if it's not by God's grace, I may fall again. And therefore, since I've fallen before, I understand how other people have treated me so badly. So these past things we've been delivered from may now arouse in us a deeper spirit of humility and a more ardent love for God. Everything should point to a more ardent love for God. The more completely a man frees himself from every taint of vice, the holier and more perfect he becomes. And so, from the point of view, one may say of virtue that it is the absence of vice. Virtue is the absence of vice. As the nut to the shell, the fruit to the rind, so is interior virtue to the other exercises of the religious life. It's not just about hearing videos about holy things, or just about making a couple of simple prayers every day. It's about striving in a life of virtue, because that's what it means to pick up your cross and follow our Lord. It's not just facing suffering. It's about trying to live the life of our Lord, which is a mortified life. But without interior holiness, all is an empty shell. In the Old Testament, descriptions of the tabernacle, we read of different kinds of curtains, all designed to protect and adorn the Holy of Holies. Curtains of violet and purple, ram skins dyed red, curtains of haircloth. Then a little cauldron, then of little cauldrons and boards, nicely placed to fit into one another, and of much else besides. So also it is in the religious life. The setting for holiness may seem intricate, be it designed for maintenance or for adornment, but true interior virtue does not lie in such things. They are but the shadow, or, if you will, a carven sign to indicate what should be found within. He who is satisfied with such and neglects the interior resembles the naked rind or the empty shell. He who satisfies with such and neglects the interior, that is the interior life of virtue, resembles the naked rind or the empty shell. Amen.